Welcome to In Defense of the Revolution, a Cuba Solidarity podcast from a Canadian perspective. My name is Cam Scott, and it's my pleasure to introduce a special episode of the podcast in which we're going to present a live recording courtesy of Paul Graham from the Ukrainian Labour Temple in Winnipeg, Manitoba, where Dr. Isaac Saney of Dalhousie University spoke on the significance of Cuba and the enormity of new U.S. attacks just this May 23rd. So Isaac has been on this podcast on multiple occasions, and this is just a selection from a strong event that you can watch on YouTube at Paul S. Graham. That's the name of the channel, but we'll link that episode in the show notes as well. First, and by way of introduction, I want to return to the premise of this show and talk a little bit about Cuba solidarity in Canada in this dangerous time, because Canada is uniquely implicated in the various means of the U.S. blockade. Every week, U.S. aggression against Cuba escalates, whether this means the new executive order of May 1st that implicates U.S. companies and individuals in secondary sanctions for engaging in trade with Cuba, including material aid, the sending of material aid. So the Canadian mining company, Sherritt, which is one of, if not the biggest foreign capital operating in Cuba, I believe, withdrew immediately, and there were board resignations as a result of these sanctions, only later to announce that it would permit U.S.-based Gielan Capital, I'm not sure how to pronounce, to buy a majority stake in its operations. Now that's closely linked to the Washburn family, Ray Washburn being a former trade and intelligence advisor to Donald Trump. So the sanctions are more cruel than ever and could even implicate the solidarity networks. One can as soon read about the Department of Justice cracking down on solidarity organizations and socialist and communist organizations in the United States as a result of their Cuba solidarity. But this twist in the story, where a significant U.S. capital wants a 55% stake in this Canadian relationship with Cuba, anticipates a neo-colonial means. And I think that the U.S. wants to do to Cuba what they're attempting in Venezuela, for example. But it will not be so simple. It's unlikely that they could ever use foreign investment as a weapon in the same fashion. There are many reasons for that. But we see them preparing for invasion, too. This month, the U.S. Department of Justice indicted former President Raul Castro, a hero of the revolution. This is very provocative, for his involvement in the 1996 downing of two planes associated with the anti-Cuban terrorist group Brothers to the Rescue. So we need to be very clear about this history, which many listeners will recall all too well. Brothers to the Rescue, led by the right-wing Miami-based Jose Basolto, is an apparently humanitarian group, named for its independent rescues of Cuban rafters fleeing the island in the mid-90s, right? But they would routinely drop anti-government leaflets from Cuban airspace and had very clearly established a plan to launch aerial attacks on Cuba. So this group's CIA ties and terrorist pedigree were very well known at the time of these attacks. And they were, in fact, one of the groups that the Cuban Five was surveilling, which is a story that remains to be told in full on this podcast. But as many listeners know, these heroes, the Cuban Five, were sent to infiltrate a number of Florida-based anti-Cuba terrorist groups. And they were charged with espionage in 1998 and would remain in prison until the momentary thaw in U.S.-Cuba policy around 2014. I think that One or two were released to house arrest in 2011, but really 2014 is how I would date that. And the shooting down of these two planes in 1996 that were dumping leaflets on Cuba from Cuban airspace was a legitimate operation after months, more than a year in fact, of warnings regarding these overflights. So not only did this happen after countless attempts at diplomacy and with ample warning, it needs to be evaluated in light of what Cuban intelligence already knew of Basilto, who was testing weapons for attacks on Cuba and its energy stations. A known terrorist. So this took place 30 years ago. Do you know General Puente of the Cuban Air Defense Force and the pilots were indicted? They weren't extradited because of the lack of diplomatic relationships, and that would have been its own separate farce. But they were indicted in 2003. So for this to be proceeding now, and for the case to be proceeding against a 94-year-old Castro, is extremely arbitrary and suspicious. And I think that it's an attempt to duplicate the structure of the Venezuelan heist of Maduro and Flores, but this is desperation on the U.S. part. The trick is that desperation doesn't bode well for anyone, and the death flails of empire can be most deadly. So before I leave the rest of this episode to Isaac, I want to speak about Canada's part in this mess. We have repeated many times, and it seems increasingly aspirational rather than factual, that Canada and Cuba are friends, are old friends. Well, this is certainly true of the Canadian and Cuban people. But Canada's government, we must say, has made itself shamefully complicit in the U.S. escalation. The ongoing travel advisories and cancellations of Canadian flights are actively choking off Cuba's lifeline, where we know that tourism is how Cuba gets currency amid a ruinous blockade. And we know that half of those tourists are Canadian. Carney and Anand have been absolutely silent on the indictment of Raul Castro. Nobody in Parliament has mentioned the Foreign Extraterritorial Measures Act, or FEMA, since the May 1st sanctions, so far as I know. Though it exists on paper to protect Canadian companies doing business in Cuba. Carney has a weaker Cuba policy than perhaps we've ever seen from Canada, and in a time of emergency. It's disgraceful. So one can't help but wonder if Canada might even change its position at the annual resolution of the United Nations General Assembly to condemn the U.S. blockade. It's not out of the question. Carney, for all of his bluster about Canadian sovereignty, seems to be following a U.S. line or anticipating a new relation to Cuba, modeled after U.S. priorities. This, to conclude, is only true of the Canadian government, not the Canadian people. Across the country, Cuba solidarity groups are mobilized. I'm come just today from a great protest at Portage in Maine here in Winnipeg in heavy heat. People were out and rowdy for the love of Cuba. Labor is mobilized at the Canadian Labour Congress in Winnipeg this May. An emergency resolution in solidarity with Cuba passed at their convention, almost unanimously condemning the blockade and pledging CLC support for the Canadian network on Cuba. There were generous pledges for aid from ETFO and other unions from the floor of the discussion. So that was exciting to see. I think a similar resolution just passed at the CUPE Ontario convention. Labor's united. Unifor released a very strong statement against the blockade, which doubles as an open letter from President Lana Payne to Carney, in which the union demands new programs to protect Canadian companies with international operations in the face of, quote, politically motivated American sanctions. I quote, As a union that upholds the principles of international solidarity, we urge the Canadian government to ensure more unnecessary economic harm does not fall upon the workers and communities of Cuba, and that we adhere to our humanitarian principles and advocate for the people of Cuba who continue to suffer from U.S. attacks of aggression that threaten global peace and stability. Working people stand with Cuba, but we need to increase the pressure and demand that our government distinguish itself from U.S. imperialism and its designs on the region. And I think on that note, I'd like to hand the podcast over to the words of Dr. Isaac Saney, recorded at the Ukrainian Labour Temple in Winnipeg on May 23rd, 2026. This is Isaac Saney on In Defense of the Revolution.
We live in dangerous, frightening, and unsettling times. I often begin my emails, with the perfunctory hope all is well, or as well as can be expected in these ever frightening and unsettling times. I am filled with terror almost every second of the day, wondering where this world is going. I am filled with terror because not only I'm concerned about humanity in general, but as a father in late life of a 7-year-old, I wonder what world she's going to grow up in. A world facing the danger of global war, where it's become normalized. A world on the verge of ecological collapse, a catastrophe that could end humanity itself. A world in which austerity, and as was pointed out, the negation of fundamental rights that belong to all of us by the fact that we are human beings, are being negated, erased, and trampled upon. And as a young girl, a world increasingly misogynistic, where people like Trump, Hegseth, believe that the handmaiden's tale is actually a blueprint for the world in how women should be placed in that world. And I think also, on the other hand, we live in a world where increasingly people are saying that this world is unjust, unfair, unequal, and unsustainable. We also live in a world in which in the last few years the interconnectedness of all of our struggles have been demonstrated. The genocide in Gaza, and I think this is very important to bear in mind, the genocide in Gaza is deeply interconnected to the violence in terms of the economic violence that's been waged within our own countries. The genocidal, and I have to say the genocidal economic blockade against Cuba would not have been able to reach its zenith if they had not been able to breach the walls of normality in terms of what can be done by imperial might in terms of the Gaza genocide. If we had been able to at least stop it or at least restrain it in some way, I think we in some ways would have had an impact on some of the other crimes that have unfolded in the world. And I think this is an important, these struggles are all very interconnected, and the Cubans have seen this, that the struggle against Gaza, the genocide in Gaza, was a very important part of the struggle, not only to preserve the humanity's rights, but also in a sense as part of defending the Cuban Revolution, which is why Palestine is such a very important aspect of Cuba's international foreign policy. So we live in a world of tremendous dangers, tremendous horrors. And of course, many of us know where Cuba fits into this. Cuba has always been a bastion and a beacon of hope. It has always been the unforgivable revolution, even more so in the context in which we're living today. When I think about the Cuban Revolution, I often pair it with the Haitian Revolution. The Haitian Revolution was the unforgivable revolution of its day, where enslaved Africans in the hundreds of thousands rose up and defeated one imperial power after another. Each of those imperial powers were rivals, but they were all united in the aim of crushing the Haitian Revolution. And it's also important to bear in mind, not only did the Haitian Revolution defeat the French, the British, the Spanish, and the French again, but they also offered solidarity to the Latin American anti-colonial struggles. Simon Bolivar spent time in Haiti and received material assistance. And so quite often the Cubans themselves, when they witnessed the cordon sanitaire, the isolation the asphyxiation that was imposed on the Haitian Revolution, they have often seen themselves mirrored in that. Which is why Haiti has been one of the privileged areas of Cuba's concentration in its foreign policy. When the massive earthquake hit in 2012, it were Cuban doctors who were the first ones on the ground treating the Haitians. And some of you may remember a meeting between Jean Chrétien and Fidel Castro, and this was before the earthquake, where Fidel pointed out that Cuba had the capacity, the human skills and resources to rebuild Haiti, particularly its healthcare system, and if Canada would provide the funds that were necessary to do this. And Chrétien dismissed it. What he wanted Cuba to do was to provide the manpower to clear mines, right? Somewhere in southern Africa so the Cubans could die. And I remember Fidel revealing this in a very powerful speech. So even as Canada had orchestrated the overthrow later on of Aristide and the imposition of these vicious IMF policies, Cuba was trying to once again repay that debt to Haiti. Because they understood there was a debt to Haiti because of what the Haitian revolutionaries had represented and accomplished. Today, we are in a world that has perhaps an unrepayable debt to Cuba. Because not only of Cuba's example, but what it has given to the world in terms of its international solidarity. As the Gaza genocide was waging, Cuba was one of the most powerful voices diplomatically condemning it. Okay, and also within Cuba, there were hundreds of Palestinians who were studying to be doctors and in other professions in Cuba free of charge. I remember meeting many of those Palestinian students and talking with them. But most poignantly, I remember the Cuban president Miguel Díaz-Canel meeting with them frequently, wearing the keffiyeh and talking with them. Such was that powerful solidarity of Cuba with the oppressed and those struggling. Of course, we also remember Cuba's incredible role in the struggle against apartheid in South Africa, supporting these anti-colonial struggles. In fact, Amílcar Cabral, the great African intellectual and revolutionary of the 20th century, who led the liberation struggle in Guinea-Bissau and Cabo Verde, in 1966, when Fidel Castro came to visit him in liberated parts of Guinea-Bissau. And I should make the point about this. Some people may not realize this. The Portuguese presence in Africa lasted 500 years. And one doesn't want to have sort of a hierarchy of who was good and who was bad as colonialists. The colonialists are all horrific. But the Portuguese were particularly malicious. In over 500 years of domination of Mozambique, for example, not one African graduated as a medical doctor. And the Portuguese presence, as I said, lasted the longest. And as they were waging these struggles to hold on to their colonies in the 60s and the 70s, they were the first to use napalm in those struggles before Vietnam, supplied by NATO. And so Amílcar Cabral, as part and parcel, to sort of paraphrase Marx often said the capitalist class always creates its own gravediggers. Well, in the case of the colonial powers, they created their own gravediggers, simply because much of the Africans who they educated to become compradors became conscious and then threw their skills into the liberation struggles. So Amílcar Cabral, who trained as an agronomist in Portugal, came back, used those skills to study Guinea-Bissau and Cabo Verde society, and then organized a liberation struggle. And when he was visited by Fidel Castro in 1966 in part of the liberated territories of Guinea-Bissau, he said, and I'm paraphrasing, "I don't believe in life after death, but I know if it does exist, that the ancestors are rejoicing to see their sons and daughters returning to Africa to help in its liberation struggle." And this was a tribute to the role that Cuba was playing in anti-colonial liberation struggles. In southern Africa, Cuba played a central, if not the crucial role in accelerating the end of apartheid. I know it's become a dominant myth within the Canadian media to attribute to Brian Mulroney sort of a central role in terms of imposing sanctions on South Africa. You know, the lie that's presented is, you know, he sat there and he was so morally outraged by the racist rule in South Africa that he spoke to Margaret Thatcher, the Iron Lady, and through the brilliance of his prose and the power of his argument, he was able to convince her that apartheid was wrong and there should be sanctions imposed. Well, anyone who's familiar with the story knows that every year that Brian Mulroney was Prime Minister before the collapse of apartheid, Canadian trade with the apartheid state went up. What has often been ignored is that Cuba played a central role, as I said. Over 400,000 Cubans served from 1975 to 1981 in the struggle against racist rule in South Africa. Over 2,000 died. And I don't want to belabor the point, but many of you are aware that there was a decisive encounter in 1987-88 at a town called Quito Cuanaval, where Cuba provided the decisive, not only resources and manpower, but the decisive strategic planning that dealt a definitive blow and defeat to the South African racist forces, altered the balance of power within the region, forcing them to the negotiating table. Which is why, when Mandela died, Raul Castro, who was then president of Cuba, was granted such a prominent place at Mandela's funeral ceremony and was introduced as the president of the country that helped to liberate us. So Cuba has done so much for the world. It has shed its blood. As an old African saying goes in regards to Cuba, Cuba is the only country to have come to Africa and gone away with nothing but the coffins of its sons and daughters who died in the struggles to liberate them. And it's important to understand that as Marco Rubio talks about Cuba supporting terrorism, you know, as he sits as the Secretary of State of the greatest terrorist power on earth, supporting the other terrorist power, the State of Israel, that when Cuba intervened in Southern Africa at the behest of a request by the Angolan government, they were fighting against one of the greatest terrorist regimes that ever existed. Millions of people died as a direct result of South Africa's intervention. For example, from 1981 to 1988, it's estimated that 1.5 million children, women and men died as a direct result of South Africa's war of terror. If you go and read the reports of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, you can get it, it comes out in 3 condensed volumes. Go into any library, there's a volume, this is the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that took place after the fall of apartheid. You'll find a volume called South Africa Outside Its Borders. And it concludes that tens of thousands of more people died outside the borders of South Africa than inside. And so Cuba shedding its blood in Angola was central to ending one of the greatest crimes of the 20th century. But beyond that, Cuba has also sent hundreds of thousands of doctors across the world. Over 600,000 Cuban doctors have served in over 160 countries, having a significant impact on the quality of life. You can actually measure in some of these countries where they serve the impact of infant mortality and maternal mortality rate. So these doctors have not only improved the lives of people who would not have had access to health care, but they've also saved lives. And so when the United States government, and particularly under Marco Rubio, cynically targeted Cuban medical missions abroad, they were basically stripping millions of people of access to health care. Particularly vulnerable to those threats were the Caribbean English-speaking nations, Jamaica, St. Lucia, Antigua. Each of them bowed venally, cowardly to US pressure. Trump threatened them with economic sanctions, threatened with cutting off visas for any national from those countries. And as many of you are familiar with the Caribbean diaspora, much of the Caribbean diaspora lives in the United States. Families would have been cut off. And so they, unfortunately, broke their contracts and ended their contracts with Cuba. But yet within places like Jamaica and these other Caribbean countries, there have been protests and marches because poor communities and the elderly have been left without doctors, without health care. So Cuba, in a sense, has saved millions of lives across the world. Some of you are also familiar with the fact that beyond just simply sending medical internationals brigades, they have trained countless doctors, okay, within Cuba. Some of you have probably been to the Latin American School of Medicine, the largest medical school in the world, where people are trained not only to become very proficient medical practitioners, but are given the commitment to go back to those communities within their own countries that would have been deprived of any sort of medical care. So Cuba has in a sense, increased the medical capacity and knowledge of these various countries. They have also developed a thriving biotech industry in which they have provided a number of medicines at very cheap costs to countries in the global south. A meningitis vaccine, for example. The most effective vaccines against COVID, produced not in the high cost and capital intensive mRNA kind of versions that we have had to be injected with here, but vaccines that are not only low cost to produce, but can be preserved at room temperature. And they've made these available for countries at very low cost. Some of you are also aware, and given what's happening in an aging population in North America and Europe, that Cuba has also developed a very effective treatment for Alzheimer's called Neuroclim. Will this be available if the United States achieves its dream of crushing Cuba? So I often ask, where does Cuba fit into this story? And we've had some allusions to that here already, mention of it. Cuba fits into the story of global war, of the assault on everything human and decent, because it represents hope. It represents the capacity to build an alternate society, a society founded on the ideas of social justice and equity, and also a society that wishes to extend these values beyond its borders and these practices. Ken mentioned the wars of independence of the 19th century. To understand the Cuban Revolution, one has to understand how much Cuba is a part and parcel of those historical aspirations. And part of those historical aspirations are the ideas of Jose Marti of creating a Cuba with all and for all. And a Cuba in which homeland is not just simply the geographical boundaries of Cuba's island nation, but the entire world. And that's what the Cuban Revolution embodies. Having extended this idea of social justice, equity, and solidarity to the entire world. This is what the United States wishes to extinguish. Okay? This is what Cuba means. It means hope. It means that it's possible not just to dream of a new society, but also to build one. One, yes, that makes mistakes. One that sometimes stumbles. One that, as in any human project, right, sometimes, in a sense, goes down blind alleys. But one that is completely committed to the idea of independence as long as it is tried to increasingly socially just society. So the United States is waging a war, not just simply to cement its control over Latin America and to snuff out any idea of independence. And I encourage anyone to read the National Security Strategy of 2025 that was put out by the Trump regime. You know, it's probably the most scrutinized national security strategy that's ever been produced. You know, when these things are produced, a few people read them. But this national security strategy, which is in one way is quite refreshing, does not hide U.S. ambitions behind pretexts and fig leaves of so-called democracy, so-called human rights, so-called bringing well-being to humanity. It's very clear. U.S. is the imperial power that must control the Americas. And independence must be snuffed out. And of course, Cuba represents the quintessential challenge to U.S. domination. But beyond just simply representing an island of independence, as I said, it represents what was described in the Kennedy administration as the Unforgivable Revolution, an alternative to the kind of austerity, the kind of attacks that are taking place on people's rights in the United States. That's what they want to extinguish. They want to destroy the very possibility of imagining a new future. And Cuba embodies that. Because even within this immense assault waged on it by the United States, over 65 years of a blockade, an economic blockade, articulated philosophically by Lester B. Mallory in his now notorious memorandum, which many of you know, of April 6, 1960, where he clearly said and established the framework, and he was in charge of inter-American affairs in the U.S. State Department, where he said, and he acknowledged, the Cuban government has overwhelming support, and the only way to alienate that support is to generate desperation and suffering by asphyxiating Cuba economically. That has been the goal. And the Trump administration, as I was talking with Cam, has turned a corner in terms of its vindictiveness and its aggression and its actual hatred. Over 240 measures in the first Trump administration that Biden kept in place. And since then, we've had the fuel blockade. We've had the sanctioning of anyone attempting to sell oil to Cuba. And now we have the sanctioning of even solidarity groups that are engaging in humanitarian aid. It speaks of desperation because they expected Cuba to collapse. I mean, there's reports that Trump is incredibly frustrated. Why have they survived? Because they have not understood Cuban history. They have not understood the resilience of the Cuban people. They have not understood that this deep yearning, not just for independence, but for social justice, a society, as Marty said, with all and for all, is deeply ingrained within Cuban history. And that they will resist the imperial powers. As Miguel Diaz-Canel said, if we must die, we will die. It's not that they have a death wish, but they will not bend. And so Trump has become incredibly frustrated, and so has Rubio. And so now they're lashing out with vindictiveness. Now, some of us are familiar with the old quote from the 1960s, comes from Mao Zedong, where he says, U.S. imperialism is a paper tiger. And yes, he's right, because it's weaker now than it's ever been before. It suffered a debacle in Iran. There's a challenge to the petrodollar, to the US dollar as a dominant currency in the world. We see a multipolar world emerging. Whether it will be a multilateral world is another issue. And so the US empire is in decline and lashing out. But Mao also said in that same quote that not only was US imperialism a paper tiger, he also said it was a real tiger. Because in its death throes, it can cause a tremendous amount of damage in its vindictiveness. And some of these individuals, these psychopaths who are running the United States, sit upon a psychopathic system. Their psychopathy is a direct result of a system in the decline and its last throes of psychopathy. And in their psychopathy, they are willing to burn the world down and rule over its ashes. They are willing to destroy something such as Cuba. A country that not only has demonstrated what you can do with limited resources in terms of creating an equitable society with social justice, whatever the contradictions you face. Not only a society that has been able to withstand what no other country would be able to withstand. What would happen to Canada if suddenly, for even a week or 2 weeks, its trade was completely cut off? There would be chaos. And yet Cuba has found creative ways to do this. The government wasn't simply standing still. They have accelerated the introduction of solar power into the country. They have prioritized hospitals and polyclinics. They have prioritized individuals who are living in their homes, who might depend on dialysis, to have these portable generators. They have also, in the midst of this, found a way to actually refine their heavy oil, so that they can perhaps produce some of the fuel it needs. They have been incredibly creative in terms of their solidarity. They have been incredibly resilient. And this has frustrated the imperialists, because they can never understand how people can resist them and not succumb to them. So Cuba, in a sense, represents the unforgivable revolution, the unforgivable example that not only is it possible to build another society, it's possible to resist imperialism. And for nearly 70 years, The US imperialists want them to suffer. They want them to pay the price for having dared stood up to US imperialism and provided an alternative example. And what does this mean? What should we do here in Canada? What should Canada do? Canada, in a sense, and at least Ottawa, has remained strikingly silent. I don't need to go over the comments that were made talking about Canada and its lack of an action regarding to Cuba, but we know that within the Canada there's a tremendous wellspring of support for Cuba. Canadians have traveled to Cuba in their hundreds and thousands, their millions, and whatever their ideological political persuasions, they've come away with a tremendous respect for Cuba. Friendships have been formed. Familiar links have been formed, and now those have been cut off because we don't have flights. And yet 51% of Canadians in a recent poll said that Canada should provide all the aid even up to oil and fuel, despite what the United States does. The Canadian Network on Cuba ran a petition where over 12,000 people called on Canada to deepen its links with Cuba, condemning the US economic blockade. We see labor unions rising to Cuba's defense. And we have received in the CNC hundreds of thousands of dollars of donations of people who want to support Cuba. And why is that? It's not just simply because defending Cuba is part and parcel of a moral duty, which it is. It's also, as was pointed out, standing up for Cuba is standing up for Canada. Because the attack on Cuba has a direct and immediate impact on Canadian sovereignty. Share It International, and somebody asked, and I argued in an article, why should we care about a corporation? These heartless corporations, you only care about profit. But it's important for Canadian workers in the face of US imperialism to defend Canadian sovereignty. And Share It International, the largest foreign investor in Cuba, at first was going to dissolve its operations in Cuba, and now has actually, with some Canadian government facilitation, sold a majority share to a Trump advisor. So Canadian economic interests in Cuba are being, in a sense, dissolved. How does this benefit Canada? How does this benefit Canada? As was pointed out, a Canada that's increasingly under attack by the United States and firmly integrated into it. And how does, in a sense, the destruction of a country like Cuba, which is able to provide and guarantee universal free healthcare, education, and other social protections, how does that benefit Canadians if that example disappears? As we face, and I mentioned earlier in the talk, the ecological catastrophe, a collapse that looms for all of us, Cuba also represents an example of trying to deal with this ecological disaster. Cuba has a plan to 2100 to deal with our ecological collapse. And in a sense, the renewed and ever aggressive attack on Cuba by Trump has forced them to accelerate their move to renewable energy. A plan to 2100. While the ecological catastrophe that looms over us has suddenly disappeared from official discourse. Carney, who gave his much misunderstood speech at Davos, is committed to increasing Canadian military spending by $81 billion over the next few years, while cutting over $50 billion from social spending. And yet in Cuba, what we see unfolding, even in the midst of this massive economic crisis, even in the midst of this massive economic war waged against it by the United States, in the midst of a looming possible military aggression, has continued to prioritize in its budgets its social services, to share what little it has among the many, while a rich country like Canada continues to work to the concentration of wealth in the hands of the few. In the midst of this massive economic challenge Cuba faces, and in the midst of US military aggression, and in the midst of this economic genocidal campaign waged by the United States, Cuba is engaged in deepening its participatory democracy, a massive decentralization campaign, to render more power and decision-making to local municipalities. But of course, that becomes even more challenging when you don't have the resources. Because part of the US economic war against Cuba, part of its destabilization campaign, part of sending continuous flights to spy on Cuba, these military flights to send them over Cuba, is to make governance in Cuba that much more difficult. It is also to shatter the idea that you can have a socialism, in which the people deeply participate in decision making. As some of you know, at every key moment in the Cuban Revolution's history, when strategic decisions have to be made, Cuba becomes a massive parliament, where massive discussion and consultation and debate takes place to reaffirm their commitment to the fundamental precepts and goals of the Cuban Revolution, but also to set a new direction in order to achieve and preserve these goals. This has happened countlessly. There are numerous examples that we could go into a Q&A. And yet in the midst of this crisis, I'm always stunned at how calm the Cubans are, the leadership, the diplomats who I've spoken to, and how they approach these crises with such calm, such planning, such insight, and continue to think about how are we going to build our project of justice, equality, and equity. This is what the United States wishes to crush. This is what Trump and his ilk cannot understand. This is what Carney, a central banker and someone who told Doug Ford, I'm more conservative than you, cannot understand. This is what is at stake. In a sense, just as at one time Vietnam was at the center of the struggle for humanity, just as Gaza has been at the center of the struggle for humanity, because the routinization of genocide, the normalization of genocide has meant that we have entered a world, in which there's no rule of law and in which imperial might is all that matters. That's the world they want. And so Cuba now is at the center of the struggle for humanity. All of these struggles are interconnected. And Fidel Castro in 1994, and I remember this vividly as if it was yesterday, we were at the first world encounter in solidarity with Cuba, and Fidel Castro gave the closing speech. And he said, and he spoke about the internationalism of the Cuban Revolution, how internationalism in a sense is central to building socialism. And if one can't show solidarity, love and compassion for people you don't even know and people who are very far away from you, how can you build a just society in your own country? But he said, at this time when Cuba was facing the dire economic consequences of the collapse of the Soviet Union, that economic crisis, he said at that time, as Cuban revolutionaries, our most fundamental internationalist duty is to preserve the Cuban Revolution, because you know what impact it would have on the struggles of other peoples if US imperialism was successful in crushing it. So in that sense, Cuba's struggle is our struggle. The preservation of the Cuban Revolution is the preservation not only of Canadian independence and right of self-determination, but the preservation of our own struggles for a better world. So in a sense, defending Cuba is defending humanity. Long live the Cuban Revolution. Viva la Revolución Cubana. Patria o muerte. Hasta la victoria siempre.
Professor Isaac Saney at the Ukrainian Labour Temple on May 23rd. Check out the whole event on YouTube. Link up with a Cuba Solidarity organization in your city. Go to CanadianNetworkOnCuba.ca and we'll see you out there.
El día primero aquel, lleno de emoción y ruido, alguien dijo conmovido y feliz, gracias Fidel. Y el pueblo después de un año repite, gracias Fidel. Y el pueblo después de un año repite, gracias Fidel.